Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behavior as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt. Welcome back to another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. It's your co-host today for this session, Tom Hardin, also known as TipperX. I present to companies as part of conduct and compliance training. More information is tipperx.com. And I'm joined with your usual host, Christian Hunt. Christian, thanks again for having me back. It's great to kick off 2020, a new decade, with a new show.
Wow, my pleasure, Tom. Nice to have you back on the show. And I know we've got some interesting stuff that we've been digging into while we've been away doing other things.
We are, and I just actually am back from the FBI, speaking there last week. So that was an interesting engagement for me to go back 10 years to the same building where I came in handcuffs 10 years prior. So it was quite a different reason to be there this time, speaking with members of an association in the industry and also current FBI agents. So that was sort of fresh on my mind, happening last week.
So they invite you back to talk to them about your experience, obviously, because most of them won't have seen this kind of thing. And it's to give the agents and others a sort of sense of what it's like to be on the other side, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting work that I'm involved in. And somebody, I guess, in my situation, rare to go around talking to companies. And so speaking with some of the FBI agents who are currently at the Bureau investigating these types of crimes. So it was interesting. I always get nervous around FBI agents, but this time it was...
Yeah, if they're welcoming you in, that's probably better than dragging you in.
Exactly. So it was an interesting talk just to kick off the year.
Awesome. What do we got this time?
So I think we're going to start off with the Luanda Leaks, talking about the situation in Angola, which I'm sure everybody is reading about now in January and February. And then you're going to talk about a rugby cheating scandal, I believe, right? Yeah.
Given we've just had the Super Bowl, I thought I would talk to you about a proper sport where something's gone hideously wrong, where they don't wear padding, but haven't necessarily behaved appropriately. So that's my piece.
Great. And then I'll finish up with another sports-related cheating story. We seem to have a lot of those in the last month or so with the Houston Astros in Major League Baseball. I'll explain a little bit how baseball works and a history of actually cheating scandals with that sport, but we'll touch on the Houston Astros, the 2017 World Series champions, although, as we know, it's not the World Series. It's played in the U.S., but we'll talk about that and then finish up with some books that we've been reading.
Okay, let's do this.
All right, so let's just jump into the Luanda Leaks. As people probably know, there's growing sort of scrutiny around Isabel dos Santos, the wealthiest woman in Africa, who's been accused of using her position to extract hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of dollars in wealth for personal gain. She's the daughter of Angola's autocratic leader who was in office until 2017. And she allegedly used her role as head of Sonangol, which is Angola's state oil company, and other state enterprises to enrich herself and her family members. Of course, she denies any wrongdoing. Thanks to the leaks, the Luanda Leaks, a catchy name, which was actually disclosed by a Portuguese whistleblower. I believe it was around over 700,000 pages of documents. Scrutiny from that has fallen on the unseemly mechanics or mechanisms that wealthy elites around the world use to steal and hide their wealth. Angola, as people may not know, is a country of diamonds, oil, and extreme inequality, one of the poorest countries in the world. So plundering of its wealth has a long colonial legacy, unfortunately, and the mass hiding of wealth through all these shell companies is kind of an updated form if we think about colonial kleptocracy. And it really exposes the systematic roots of the problem that are visible in the role of what I wanted to talk about later when we talk about this is kind of this wealth defense industry, as one journalist called it. You know, the tax lawyers, the accountants, the consultants, the wealth managers that kind of facilitate and enable this type of looting process, kind of the people who are willfully blind to what's going on. Of course, these are often Western companies that play an essential role in kind of this sort of global plundering apparatus, as another journalist called it. So that's just setting it up. And Christian, if you have any sort of initial thoughts on these leaks in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, so I find this kind of interesting. So I'll admit, firstly, I had to look on a map where Angola was, and it's on, and I'm sure the audience knows this, but just to remind them, it's on the west coast of Africa. It's kind of just below the bit where if you were to connect South America and Africa as they once were, It's kind of on that just that sort of southern bit of where they would nicely interconnect. And so looking at it, all of this stuff, it doesn't really surprise me, but the practices belong in a kind of colonial era. And I think when one looks back and sitting here in the UK, people talk about the British Empire. There's a lot of scandal and history associated with overseas exercises by countries and colonial species, particularly in places like Africa. So I was on the part of me just sort of when it is not surprising that in a less developed country with a kind of colonial history, where, as you say, there is a lot of wealth in the kind of raw materials there, that there is some history of this stuff going on. What I think is surprising was the volume of it going on today, because I'd really assumed that this stuff had kind of belonged in the, I'm not saying it's appropriate, but kind of came out of the, the maybe 17th, 18th, 19th century, not the 21st century.
Right. It's interesting. There's a PBS documentary, which I'm not sure European listeners can view it over there, but if you can, it's a frontline documentary just about this, and it just really shows. We always hear about, the societal impact of bribery and corruption really hurts people, and when you really see it in a country like Angola, there's sort of pictures of Dos Santos's lavish life juxtaposed against people living in the country where obviously there's no clean water, there's all kind of disease, living on basically one of the poorest countries in the world. That really sort of hits you in the face as to how the price of this type of corruption impacts society. And
as you say, this is sort of an international issue. And it's clearly, there are plenty of tales of people exploiting things on their kind of home turf, as it were. But this is facilitated by international machinery, where I think you've got people participating who would claim to have higher ethical standards, and yet are facilitating this piece. And I suspect this is the tip of a very big iceberg of lots of these sorts of things going on. This is just particularly egregious and needed a whistleblower. To kind of reveal what was going on.
Right. The Portuguese whistleblower, who I think also blew the whistle on some football shenanigans a couple of years ago. Football Leaks blew the whistle here. And it's interesting if we compare this Luanda Leaks to, I'm sure people are familiar with the $1 billion whale book and the 1MDB scandal in Malaysia, where a who's who of international banks, were involved in the money laundering for Joe Low and 1MDB. We're actually in this situation, as the banks looked at Dos Santos, major banks, Deutsche, Barclays, Citigroup, a who's actually refused to do business with her as they looked at sort of these shell companies. But, the consultants, the big four, specifically PwC, went ahead and, I believe was her consultant, her tax advisor, her accountant, and they were taking actually payments from these shell companies, which to any money laundering professional at a bank, of course, would set off red flags. Yet these smaller sort of army of accountants and lawyers and consultants and advisors were almost working to kind of subvert those defenses that the banks, obviously have built over the last couple of decades.
Clearly, this stuff, you need help, right? This is not, right. I mean, one of the things about the banking system finally kind of getting with the program. I mean, there's still a way to go. Let's be clear about that. But one of the things about the banking system getting it together is that it's a little bit harder than it used to be. And so clearly, these organizations, they're not just kind of like you've picked a wrong one to stick on your client list. You are actively involved in this to facilitate and to open doors and to provide structures and cover-ups that allow this thing to happen.
Right. And auditors, specifically at PwC, I mean, in the last couple years, obviously, there's been other scandals and things that were not spotted. Thinking about the construction giant Carillion, I believe it's the name, the retailer BHS, the cake chain Patisserie Valerie. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly.
These are all UK companies. This is embarrassing, but go on.
Right. I'm pouring it on.
Yeah, that's fine.
But before they went bust, obviously the auditors didn't see that coming, and PwC actually launched a £30 million action plan. I believe last year, I was just reading an article from about a year ago in 2019, where they actually set aside a few days of training for their auditors on topics such as fostering skepticism, sort of in a classroom setting away from work, but, pulling people away from their high pressure, billable hour jobs as auditors to focus on these classroom, setting training sessions. Is that actually working? As we see, with this scandal, I'm sure future scandals, maybe there's another way to think about training auditors in these situations. But PwC looked at it after some of these other scandals, but it didn't really obviously do much, is what we're seeing today.
Yeah. And what's interesting here, I think, is that on the one hand, I think most of us have been in positions where we've sort of had, you're asked to do something and you don't have much time or ability to question, particularly if your job is under pressure. Either you need to be seen to perform. And so there's a huge amount of pressure on people on those things. On the other hand, we also see lots of tales, I think, of individuals, kind of spotting and recognizing that something's not quite right and having the courage to stand up and say something and call it out. And I think there's something interesting here in that there's a human component to this, and it requires a huge amount of bravery to come out as a whistleblower, particularly if you've been put under huge amounts of pressure. But that's incredibly valuable and powerful. So I'm struck by that piece of it. But the second thing is, I think there's this sort of, there is a lot of pressure being put on these people in these organizations, and there's clearly conflicts of interest sometimes around this between revenues and your independence and checking. And I'm always struck. A long time ago, I worked in France for an audit firm, one of the predecessor firms of the one you mentioned, actually. And it's interesting, and I presume this is still the case, but in France, you're required to rotate your auditor every so often.
Yeah.
With a view to freshening it up and getting a fresh pair of eyes. And I think that's an interesting way of kind of thinking about that dynamic, because it recognizes that people get comfortable, and there is a human element to this stuff that I think is, we look at audit firms and we go, you're here to audit and you've got a big brand name and a big thing, whatever. But ultimately, it's people going in there making judgment calls about what they see. And if they choose to be blind, that's a bit of a challenge. Now, technology can help with that, but we do have to think about this when we've got people in kind of roles where, you're here to check that everything's okay and act as a credible deterrent and then those people, they're only human. And we need to think about the pressures that they're under. Now, I would like to think that if I had seen the things that I read about, that I would have said something. But, who knows? I got to be honest and say that I'm just as fallible as anyone else when it comes to these things. And who knows if you're sat there under huge amounts of pressure and told to just get this audit signed off, and it's a big client that is paying your firm lots of money, maybe your ability and your willingness to challenge is understandably compromised.
Yeah, and I think as we talk about not only this story, but past stories we've talked about, we could almost have a button you could press for willful blindness. We could just sort of say, yep, here's that willful blindness again, popping up in this situation with this story. And I think to your point, I'm sure there's somebody, at the auditor who obviously was aware of these red flags, especially with the payments coming into the auditor through these shell companies. I mean, how do you not know that something is awry? But again, the pressure of fees, getting these consulting fees, the auditing fees. It's all. I wonder. I guess with the banks passing on this, obviously, the regulator with the banks, obviously has very strict enforcement guidelines with the banks. But then the regulators on these sort of consultants and auditors maybe needs to step up their role. I'm sure they will after this and look at. What do we do about deterrence here? How should we think about, policing these firms a little bit closer where, what's obviously what they've been doing in the past hasn't been working, investing in. There was even one in the Big Four who I read actually introduced compulsory yoga and mindfulness sessions for 4,000 UK audit staff. And that was interesting last year. They're under stress. They're pushing the line in these situations. And one of the Big Four said, everyone has to attend a 3-day session aimed at helping them deal with the stress of being an auditor. So, now we have to have mandatory, you're required to participate in mandatory, a mandatory hour of fun per day. And so, right. So I guess you charge that to like the fun time code.
It's like enforced fun. It's just, we all know when you've been dragged to something. I would suggest that dragging someone to something like mindfulness and yoga is probably not going to have the desired impact. But hey.
And one of the other Big Four brought in somebody to teach them about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and so they're thinking about behavioral science, obviously, but this sort of forced training or awareness obviously isn't working. So I don't know if it's a situation where the regulator has to step up and do more, as they would with the banks, or
But you know, I think this is a fascinating topic, right? Because whenever you get things going wrong in organizations, and I get brought into companies to look at stuff, and it's all about how do we retrain our people. The implicit presumption behind that is that everything is okay with the organization. And if it wasn't for these, you know, people messing it up, we would deliver the objectives we want. And yet all too often it is the environment that is promoting those things. And so as you talk about the proposed solutions, the first solution is always training. So we will go and train our people to make sure they don't do that again. And I'm always struck by this thing of saying, look, if it is the environment that is driving people to do that, and by the environment, I mean the physical environment, but also the culture and the pressures you put on people, if that is causing that behavior, and inevitably it will play some part if these things are widespread enough. And let's be honest, if you think you need to train all of your people, then that does tell you that there's something more than just it being an individual thing. It's across the piece. So there must be some environmental factors. Then what you're actually doing, I think interesting, if you don't change the environment, is you might be able to reprogram some of your people for some of the time. But actually, you'll bring new people in, and all you're doing, it's a bit like a sort of a soil. And if the soil is rotten, trying to put new plants into that old soil won't change it. You're just going to develop the same piece. And I think so many organizations here view these, people aren't doing what we want. Therefore, what we will do is we will just simply reprogram the people and then we'll be fine. And they don't look at the underlying environment and some of the stresses. And I worry really that when the headlines read mandatory yoga and mindfulness, much as that's positive, that's not fixing the problem. That is actually dealing with one of the symptoms. And if you don't fix the underlying problem of the environment that's causing this sort of behavior, you're going to get repeat performances. And so I think you're slightly wasting your money on this thing. And it screams to me of a kind of headline catching initiatives that sort of says, what have you done? Well, we have sent everybody on this thing and now they're sorted. And we've seen it with Me Too, similar sorts of things. Let's send everybody on sort of anti-sex pest training. And that's not going to, you need to deal with some of the fundamentals here. So I think there's something interesting that says if we're dependent on human beings in these environments, we need to empower those human beings. And I wouldn't like these organizations to be able to get away with just a kind of bit of window dressing around retraining people when actually there's some fundamentals there that I think you can recognize if you start to look at the dynamics in which they're operating.
Yeah, and that's, as you just described, that's an analogy I make to what I do is, it's often I'll be brought into a company that has had issues. And, we got the bad apples, we punished them. Then there was more bad apples, we punished those bad apples. But again, to your point, what's the barrel here? What's going on in the barrel, not just the bad apples? Why do we have bad apples? Going back to looking at the barrel.
So shall we move on to sporting matters? And look, so I want to talk about rugby, which for American listeners is basically like what you call football, but we don't have padding, and it's traditionally been a sort of it's traditionally been an interesting gentleman's sport where, strangely, unlike other forms of sport in England, the spectators were all the spectators were civilized, and then there was quite a lot of sort of aggression and anger on the pitch. And rugby used to be a kind of amateur game that literally you had international players who would the weekends play for England and a club, or their country and a club, and then they go back to doing a day job. And it recently became professionalized, and so people were playing full time in common with many other sports. And what we've seen in the UK recently is one club, Saracens, who were very successful, who had an investor that came in. And what it turned out was they put in place pay caps so that they wouldn't have a kind of arms race in terms of how much players were paid. And it transpired that Saracens had got round this pay cap by basically doing side deals with players on a monumental scale. So you had, you weren't paying them directly in salary, but they were making arrangements, investing in properties with them and trying to structure things that were clearly designed to get around the rules, but technically weren't necessarily breaches of them. Everybody's looking through that and going, this is outrageous. And so there's a big scandal around that particular piece because clearly this was an avoidance tactic that has broken one of the fundamentals of this sport that had, only in the recent decades moved into the professional era. So it's pretty shocking in that space because it is a sport that has thrived on, kind of gentlemanly behavior, for want of a better phrase.
Yeah, and from what I understand, to your point, rugby was the one sport to kind of have to or be held up to higher standard compared to cycling or other situations that have gone through their own problems where kind of shocking for this to happen in the sport. But is this a situation, just reading about it, where this could have been handled before the season started? I mean, do we obviously Saracens' poor conduct and the chairman Ray, but also looking at PRL, there's probably a lot of skepticism about them, their transparency with all this, their governance at the PRL level, where they could have dealt with this before the season started, rather than piling on now with demotion to the championship.
I think look, they've come down on them really hard, and they've sort of dealt with it. But you're right, because I kind of think this is an interesting question for sport as a whole, where the stakes are getting higher, and so you introduce rules to stop things getting out of control. And a salary cap, I think, is a sort of obvious mechanism there to stop costs spiraling out of control, and also to make sure that you end up with a kind of relatively fair competition. And, so the fact that you need to introduce these things tells you there's a risk there. And I think sometimes you get sporting authorities kind of clumsily coming in with something without fully building a proper control framework around it and kind of hoping that these brutal measures are going to work. And so there's a little bit of me that says, was this, just general question, was this predictable? Well, probably. And could they have done something earlier on? Probably as well. And I think it's interesting when you look at sporting bodies who are very adept at certain types of kind of risk management, very hot on managing branding of the sport and how it comes across, but actually haven't necessarily built the infrastructure around some of the other things. And as money floods into these places, the opportunity and the incentive for people to kind of stretch the limits a little bit, break the rule, increases. And so I think this is a really interesting example of sort of sport on the one hand tries to hold itself up as being very immoral. And here we have sportsmen who conduct themselves well. But there's some of these other side issues that we've seen happen in other sports where I think the kind of, they need to think a little bit more carefully, and they probably need to modernize risk management from the sport as a whole. And that's just not been there up until now.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'm just in my head thinking about our next story too, with sport, comparing the punishments sent down and who sort of knew who was culpable on the teams. And it seems like with Saracens, obviously you could say the players benefited, of course. They won these championships. They were part of the team who was breaking the rules. But also it seemed like, decisions at the top by Chairman Ray and a few players to engage in this behavior, to go over the cap, and then to be relegated down a total of 70 points, which effectively makes them down in the championship. When, as a rugby player, you're negotiating your own contract, your agent, you just want the best that you can get for yourself, because I'm assuming your sort of span of playing at this level is obviously limited. So you want to sort of monetize that as well as you can. And then to have your sort of people at the top let you down, now what's going to happen to these world-class players on the national team playing in the championship? And then, so these guys, I mean, I understood they played together as teenagers, like they really came up together over the years. The Saracens way, they'd go around sort of talking to companies, right, about the Saracens way of doing things. And now I guess that's always a red flag if we're going out pounding our chest.
I think there's something interesting in sport as a kind of a carrier of values, right? Because we send kids, we send kids off on to play sports so they learn about teamwork and all sorts of pieces. And there's always been this kind of thing about, sporting values. And that's why we bring in, we have drug testing. Because if we wanted to watch our athletes performing at the maximum that the human body is capable of, we'd allow people to take drugs. But we like this idea of a level playing field and predictability and human endeavor and all those particular pieces. But I think there's something interesting happening in the sporting world around, I think the espoused values are running miles ahead of the reality on the ground. And so the more money gets infused, and this will bring us nicely onto your piece. The more money gets infused into this thing, the harder I think it is to continue to do that. And rugby, I think, was held on to that amateur status and moved into the professional era much later than many other sports. And so there's probably a greater shock that they've kind of lost their way a little bit around that. When it was always, you knew when you watched the England rugby team, for example, you knew that so-and-so worked for a gas company and someone else was an accountant and someone else was an Air Force pilot. I mean, literally, that's what they did. And it kind of was almost like you could name which team they played for and also what they did in their day job. And so I think it's particularly shocking in that sphere, but I just see lots of examples of sports trying to hold that moral high ground because I think they would ultimately lose viewers. It astonishes me, by the way, that anyone watches WWE, whatever it's called now.
Oh, it's big time. Yeah.
because that's not a sport, that's acting.
Right.
And we you just sort of, I watched that for about 30 seconds and I just laugh at it because you kind of know it's pre-scripted and ridiculous. Whereas sport, the drama element and the engaging piece comes from the fact that you don't know what's going to happen, and therefore you need those level playing fields.
And I think we'll just see how it plays out. I mean, the fans obviously control all the economic value here, whether they want to continue to attend the matches or not, and they can vote with their own hard-earned money. So it'll be interesting how this.
Yeah, I mean, there's another way to look at it, right? Yeah. And say, look, if your team is winning, you don't know what arrangements have been done behind the scenes. Maybe you don't care. Right, so it's interestingly, they may not lose that much in terms of their fate. It's other people that might be disgusted. And so then it gets to an interesting question about, people's willingness to accept rule breaking when it's your own side doing it. And I think we've got lots of examples in politics now where in a kind of polarized world where if the other people are doing it, it's disgraceful. And yet if it's happening on your own team, well, isn't that part of the game a little bit? So I think there's some interesting microcosms of kind of life playing out here.
And that's a great segue into our final sports story we can talk about. With the Houston Astros, and of course I'll explain, I'll assume some familiarity with baseball with our European listeners, but just some context before we get into the scandal and what happened. A couple years ago, I think it was 2015, Major League Baseball, the governing body of baseball in the U.S., instituted a replay system. And so what they did was put a camera in center field, and this allowed each team to put a monitor from that camera into their clubhouse. So you may, if you watch a baseball game, if you've seen one on TV, you see each team kind of has their own clubhouse where the batters sit and then go out and bat. But in that clubhouse, they could have a monitor from that camera feed so they can make a decision on whether they want to challenge an umpire call on the field. And that's in the last few years, they put this technology in. But as we know from other industries and technology, there's also unintended consequences of this technology, which are often not seen as the technology is introduced. And what the Houston Astros, who were the 2017 World Series champions, so again, in sort of comparison to Saracens, the top team, decided they would use that feed, make another copy so that they could steal signs from the catcher. So what that means is there's a pitcher and a catcher. The catcher is often giving signs with his hand to the pitcher on what kind of pitch should the pitcher throw. There's typically a few pitches a pitcher can throw: a fastball, a curveball, a changeup, based on how the pitch leaves the pitcher's hand, the speed, the velocity of that pitch that the catcher signals with their hand. And to communicate what the catcher was signing to the pitcher, the opposing team against the Astros went even further and in a very rudimentary way would bang a trash can lid with a baseball bat for which pitch was coming. One bang for a fastball, two bangs for an off-speed pitch. I believe there was also no bang for a curveball. They did this when they won the 2017 World Series season. And during that season, Major League Baseball actually issued a warning to teams saying they were aware of this nefarious conduct and they'd be severely punished. That was actually in response to the Boston Red Sox, another team who are using Apple Watches in the dugout to communicate signs to players. So a more advanced way to do this rather than banging trash can lids. Obviously, the Astros continued to bang the trash can lids. They actually stopped doing it in 2018 once it wasn't effective anymore. And it wasn't until November 2019 that there was a whistleblower, a former pitcher on the Astros, Mike Fears, who came out, spoke to some reporters at theathletic.com, who then released the expose article detailing everything. And in the last few months, Major League Baseball investigated and then came out with their decision. But we can sort of pause there before we get to that and just thinking about this orchestrated cheating that was going on that the players were aware of. So in contrast, again, to our Saracen story, where I think most of the players weren't aware of what was going on with the salary cap.
So this is an interesting one for me because I kind of go, you've introduced technology that facilitates this. So presumably based on what you said, before the introduction of this technology, this form of cheating would not have been feasible. Is that right?
It was a game within the game. So it used to be looked at as okay if we're trying to get up to that line and cheat just a little bit. So what would happen is this a player who's maybe on second base would look at the catcher's signs to try to relay those signs to his team. So it was kind of gamesmanship, game within a game, trying to figure it out, but nothing sort of systemic cheating like we saw with the Astros.
So that's interesting, right? Because you've talked a lot about gray areas. And you sort of go, okay, I could concoct a logic that says if it's okay for me to do it in that context, then what is the difference if something is introduced? It's not like I have installed secret cameras, right? This has been facilitated, and it's something that everybody kind of knows we're doing anyway. And so I think that's a really interesting sort of slide. Now, where it starts to get a bit more difficult to explain is in the transmission mechanism, because the traditional kind of gray area that I've just described, everybody knows it's going on. You can kind of see it, and it's not scalable and repeatable, and it requires someone to be in the right position, right? So it's a tactic you can deploy at a certain point in the game. Whereas this is kind of institutional, and you shouldn't be doing it because you're banging something and you're not putting a sign up to go, this is what's coming now. You're doing it on the sly. So I think there's an interesting thing that I can sort of see how the behavior might kind of be justified, but actually we know that it's crossed a line because of the communication method. And if they've issued a warning about it, then that's insane, right? So you definitively know that what you are doing is wrong. There's no doubt.
Right.
I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah, that they issued the warning during the season. They continue to do it. And to MLB's credit, I guess they actually acted pretty swiftly. So it came out in November 2019, the expose. And just 2 months later, the MLB came out, had interviewed 68 people. What the MLB did, and there's some controversy around this, is they gave all the players involved immunity to come forward. And we know sort of in the corporate setting that individuals are always held accountable that are involved in the nefarious behavior, the corruption, the bribery, or whatever. But MLB came out and gave all players immunity so they could get this investigation done as quickly as possible. They came out and said, look, there's a bench coach on the Astros, so think about that as an assistant coach who was heavily involved with this. He was actually moved on to be the head coach of another team who was fired by his new team, the Boston Red Sox. There was another player, Carlos Beltran, the only player named in MLB's investigation who was named. He was actually retired, a manager of the New York Mets, and the New York Mets fired him when his name came out. Now, A.J. Hinch, who was the manager of the Astros, said he didn't know about it, but he also would break camera monitors with a bat when he heard about it. So he kind of knew about it, but saying he didn't know about it. He's been fired and given a 1-year ban from the sport. And Jeff Luhnow, who's the general manager, think about that as for the CEO of the team who works for the owner, was also suspended for 1 year. And Luhnow came out and said, I didn't know about it, but of course, Tony at the top, if this is going on at your organization, he's fired for a year. MLB fined Houston Astros $5 million. So that's as high as they could fine them. Now, Houston Astros team value is $1.1 billion.
That's peanuts, right?
Right before the World Series championship, $1.8 billion after winning the World Series, $700 million increase in team value, $5 million fine. 29 of 32 owners were asked, would they do this same thing to have that increase in value and pay that fine? Unofficially off the record, 29 to 32 owners said, yes, that's the price of doing this. $5 million, I'd do it also to have that increase in team value. So again, a situation where the fine is maybe the cost of doing business, unfortunately.
This I find sort of amazing because, as you say, it's institutionalized and there's kind of like a sort of limited remorse there.
Yes.
It's like, well, that's just the way things are, right? And I don't know. It's a sort of astonishing. And so part of me, it just looks at it and goes, this is shocking. This is awful. And then I go, actually, when we start to unpick some of the dynamics here, you can sort of start to see the logic processes that people might go through. So if I own this franchise and I'm putting a chunk of cash at play here and I want to be the prestigious owner, then, we can, we'll kind of live, as you say, we'll live with the fines and we'll sort of deal with that particular piece. And if I'm playing, I want to be winning. And if I've got everybody doing it, then maybe it's a kind of a So I sort of think this again is if we tie it back to that kind of audit discussion, you can sort of see how motivations of individuals can lead to all sorts of collective behaviors. And we can go back further in history and look at some really awful things where there were lots of people playing a role in this piece that led to something that was pretty big. And I think there are some, this is a fascinating, again, microcosm of dynamics that we see in other situations that can probably tell us something, which is people are capable of doing stuff that they know to be wrong, that they know collectively to be wrong. And yet we're also perfectly prepared, or, there are people up there prepared to kind of whitewash this stuff and say, well, it's sort of this, that's what happens, isn't it, type thing.
And it's interesting, too, some of the baseball commentators and other players' reaction to this. Obviously, people are upset, but there's also one commentator on ESPN, the main sportscaster who shows a lot of these games, who said, what happens in the clubhouse stays in the clubhouse. This person should have never blown the whistle. This is not how it works in MLB. It shouldn't have escalated to this. And more people have actually taken her side on that view, which, again, in the corporate world, we encourage people in our talks to speak up. If you see something nefarious, say something. But that's sort of looked at by a lot of people in the sport. What happens in the clubhouse, quote, stays in the clubhouse. You shouldn't blow the whistle on this. So,
wow,
frustrating to think about in terms of the work we're doing, but also, there's an anything goes to win type of mentality that's always been there in the sport. So.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of does beg the question about the importance of sport as a cultural driver. Yeah. And there's been some interesting stuff in Europe and on football where they've introduced video assistant referees, so soccer for American listeners, and there's a whole load of question around that and saying sort of the technology on the one hand sounds really good, on the other hand poses all sorts of further challenges because suddenly the rules start to, minutiae in terms of sort of being over a line starts to count hugely. And so we've had that trend kicking in where sort of technology is useful to really make sure the rules are there, but that brings its own complexities. And then you've had a load of clamping down on player rebellion against referees. And so players are being sent off in some leagues for kind of dissent. And they're clamping down on it because they're saying it sets a bad example to kids and to people watching. And I think sports hit a really interesting point where there's sort of quite a lot at stake emotionally and financially. And there's technologies coming in and allowing us to see things that weren't there before, that weren't visible before, and is also facilitating. So there's a whole load of things. And I think sports going through a very interesting time at the moment where sort of, what is the rule of law? What's morally acceptable and not? And the moment you add in technology or you scale something up, and these things can have a massive advantage, right? Very small tweaks to things can have a massive advantage. And if it's just the result that matters, we all know what happens in organizations when you get that kind of, do whatever it takes mentality. I think sports on a real tipping point here. In terms of sort of some of these questions that have probably never been asked before. And I think there's these various dynamics coming to play to add it. So I think we're going to see more and more of this stuff, right? Because it probably is prevalent in other sports as well.
Yeah, and other teams in Major League Baseball. I'm sure this isn't the end of the investigation. And it was just sort of discouraging to see the owner of the Houston Astros said, when we get down to spring training, which is actually happening in 2 weeks, where the pitchers and catchers go down to Florida, where it's warm right now, to get ready for the season, he said, we'll get all our players together and they'll come out with a strong statement as a team. And I think apologize for what happened, and move forward. And I'm thinking, well, is there really, there's no stronger statement than, a rehearsed apology made like 4 weeks after you've been caught. Like that's sort of the laissez view from a lot of people in the sport right now. So,
wow. Do you know what? I'll tell you, here's the interesting bit. It does make me want to watch baseball, which is
there you go.
Because I'm sort of fascinated a little bit. You get an insight into something and you go, how does that work? So there's a little bit of me. There may be some extra viewers coming in from somewhere. So potentially not about, there's no such thing as bad publicity, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Get your trash can lids ready.
Right. Yeah. So I'll be looking out for that as we go. So should we move on and talk about some books that we've been reading? What's on your reading list at the moment?
I wanted to just talk about one book I read from the late Harvard business strategy professor, Clayton Christensen, who passed in January after a long battle with cancer at the age of 67. And when he would teach at Harvard Business School on the last day of class, he would always ask his students to turn kind of this theoretical lens he had taught them in class on themselves to find answers to 3 questions he would write on the board. First, how can I be sure that I'll be happy in my career? Second, how can I be sure that my relationships with my spouse and my family become an enduring source of happiness? And third, he'd say, how can I be sure I'll stay out of jail? And so, something I wish I read before my endeavor or my life experience. But he noted actually when he went back to his reunion at business school that several former classmates, including Jeffrey Skilling, who was the former CEO of Enron, had spent time in prison. And he said, these were good guys, but obviously something in their lives sent them off in the wrong direction. So in his book, How Will You Measure Your Life, which I actually read as I was trying to translate my negative self-inflicted life experience from before into a training session today, one of the things that he warns about is what he calls marginal thinking. And the way he talks about it is he says, look, we're all presented with moral challenges throughout life. And when we think about doing something, he calls it just this one time, because the marginal cost appears to be negligible, then we get suckered into the behavior. And then we don't see where that path will ultimately take us, nor do we appreciate the full cost of the choice. And it could be one of many things he talks about, misrepresenting expenses or revenues, stuffing a distribution channel, insider trading my case, paying a bribe to gain business, whatever. And he just says the landscape is littered with people who never gave a thought to crossing the line, quote, just this once, thinking they would never get caught. And doing the right thing 100% of the time is easier than doing it 98% of the time, which we all understand. And if we break our own rules just once, we can justify the small choices again and again. And he calls it, using marginal cost thinking to justify all these little small decisions leading up eventually to a big one. But then when that big one comes, it doesn't really seem enormous to us anymore because we've taken all these incremental steps away. So it's a lot of what I try to work into my corporate talks, but also just a nice way to frame it. And as I reflected back on one of the first books I read around moving on with my own life and how do I make sense of this self-inflicted experience, just seeing his passing kind of jarred that memory back into my head.
And I think that is fascinating in the context of the book you discussed last time, right, which was James Clear's Atomic Habits.
Right.
Because these are the flip sides of the same thing, right? So we can take baby steps into building a positive habit, or we can take baby steps into, or even bigger steps if you like, but we can take baby steps into doing something that's less good. And the dynamic is the same, right? It's building up. And I think it's fascinating when you talk about that articulation and we think about your story. There is a lot of the things that you have talked about that kind of chime, which is, starts off small, how harm can be done, and it builds up. And I think that's a really interesting articulation around that piece. I guess my sort of response to that would be, well, isn't part of the challenge here that we're calibrating against getting caught? Right. And of course, that is down to an externality, which sort of says, I'm making an assessment of the likelihood at that point in time. And of course, the likelihood of getting caught doing something once is much less than doing it on a repeated basis. And particularly if you're scaling up. Right. And so I think one of the interesting things there is if I took an example of jaywalking, so illegally crossing the road when the lights are red for people that's not a concept on, and I sort of think if I do that once, my chances of getting caught are less than if I do it 100 times, because there's less. I'm doing it less times, and you could make the same. And so it's an interesting one if we're calibrating based on the likelihood that first time. We probably have less awareness about whether we're likely to be caught the first time we cross that piece, but we're referencing it by some externality as opposed to some sort of intrinsic value system. And I don't know how we think about that because in many cases, genuinely, if you do something once, there is a low likelihood of getting caught or lower than certain other things.
Yeah, and I think what he tries to do in the book is just saying, look, doing the right thing 100% of the time where that's your internal value system is a lot easier than doing it, 98% of the time. So just that internal value system, knowing that, okay, we may get caught, we may not, but we're never going to make that decision just this once. Kind of having that as kind of a nice framework and thinking about, situations through our careers.
So I'm shifting it away from the externality of whether I'll get caught onto it is easier to live with myself if I have a kind of purity around that space, and therefore it's actually driven intrinsically rather than extrinsically.
Yeah, and it's what we both talk about, I think, too, that the can I versus the should I, which I know we both sort of hit on that in our lectures.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So remind us, what's that called?
It's How Will You Measure Your Life by Clayton Christensen. So it's a lesser known book that he's known for, but it really struck with me. And I should go back and read it again because it just puts everything into context.
Wow. I love it. One of the things I find really interesting is when you get people that talk about something and then they talk about how it's resonated for them. Yeah. That can often be a really, really appealing way to get into something. So I love this book because it's much better than you should just read this.
Right, exactly.
So that was some interesting insights. Wow. Okay. I'll be checking that one out.
What's been on your reading or viewing?
So I have been reading 21 Lessons for the 21st Century by Yuval Noah Harari, which people may know as the author of Sapiens. And this is one of those, what I describe as airport books. And it's a good airport book. You know, the kind of thing you see as you dash through that's sitting there, and it kind of has an interesting title. And I'd resisted because I thought it just sounded a bit silly. But I was talking to someone around, this is me explaining why I read this book, right? I was talking to someone around models under which we run the world. And I'm thinking of everything from the way democracies operate through to some of the structures that we have within our lives. So whether that's the way companies are run, you know, and that brings us into sort of climate and sustainability type topics, or even looking at things like education, where you would say, does our education system equip us for dealing with 21st century? And do our cognitive processes allow us to handle so that the discussions around smartphone addiction, social media, all of those sorts of questions. And so I was looking at that and saying, you know, back to the conversation we'd had earlier around the environment often impacts our behavior. And of course, if we are part of a structure, then that's part of the environment. And if that structure isn't helping us to do the right thing, there's almost an inevitability to stuff going. So I was looking and saying, if we want to change behavior, how do we look to change some of the environment? I'm not suggesting I can single-handedly overturn the education system, but I think there are lessons for all of us in sort of what we see around us. And this book really gets to grips with that and sort of says, look, here are the things that aren't working out, where we have depended on legacy logic. And sometimes that legacy logic made sense, a little bit like cognitive biases, right? Made sense for a different world, or we didn't know any better then, or it sort of was the best we could come up with what we had. And then you say, well, is it still appropriate for the 21st century? And I'm finding myself reading it and just questioning a lot more and thinking a lot more about why do we do things? And you know, that kind of childhood thing, which I'm sure you must have had as well, because I just sense it from you. But I was always one of those annoying kids that said, well, why? And I was encouraged to ask questions.
Yeah.
And I'm finding myself doing that as an adult. And as I wander around and I look, particularly at political processes here in the UK, and I look at the parliament building we have, which is set up to be confrontational. It's not set up to be collaborative. They have seats sitting opposite each other. We've got an electoral system that disenfranchises a whole load of people. And so I just, I start with obvious things like that, but there's so many more things I think are really interesting around how we do stuff. And so this has just blown my mind a little bit. And I like reading stuff quite quickly. This one I'm reading a little bit more slowly because I just have to think each time. And I find that quite a refreshing thing from time to time, because there's so many books I read that are eminently skimmable.
And it's different. I've only heard a podcast interview he's talked about this book, but I'm obviously familiar with Sapiens and Homo Deus. But it's interesting in the interview, I was listening to him talk about the book and how he reconciles kind of religious beliefs and rational thinking. And I can't wait to get to that book. I'll be curious how it impacts me. But
yeah, and I think it's when you talk about things like religions and pieces. I mean, one of the things I find fascinating is that on the one, there is much to criticize around religions. But there's also some tremendous stuff. And I was struck by the conversations that you and I had before around the Catholic confessional.
Right.
And that seemed to me, that you talked around you going for that when you needed someone to speak to and to unburden yourself.
Right.
And I think that's a really sophisticated model that's been around for a long, long, long time and really understands intuitively that people need to get things off their shoulders and need somewhere where they can kind of anonymously tell a tale. And so I look at that aspect of it and I go, that I think is a really powerful example of where something was created a long, long time ago and really adds value, I think. and is very smart, you look at other aspects of it and you think, well, of any religion, there's not a specific comment on the Catholic Church. There's stuff that's less fit for purpose. And I think it's fascinating when we start to explore why we do things, because there is stuff there that was created for a reason. And I'm always struck by, I tend to be one of these disruptive people that goes, this is useless, let's change the way we do things, without thinking about, well, how do we get there? And that's really important to recognize that there may have been some logic. And you got to question, does that logic still apply as to why stuff is there? So I would love to hear what you have to say about this, because I think it's one of those ones that will prompt all sorts of interesting thinking from your different perspectives on things, and really I think might help to formulate some, it's the sort of thinking in the book that will help formulate proper solutions to 21st century challenges, not on its own, but as part of a broader piece.
Well, it was great to be back as co-host to kick off the year with you on another episode of the Human Risk podcast.
My pleasure, Tom, as ever. And no doubt we'll be back probably with some more sporting stories. I know we mentioned last time the tennis coaching thing. I've been looking into that a little bit. And I don't want to reveal too much as what I found yet, because it's sort of it's work in progress. But I think there's going to be more to come on that. And I suspect we'll pick up sport on a later episode as well. But we'll find some other topics. And of course, if our listeners have anything that they think we ought to explore or look at, we are delighted to take a look at that.
Look forward to seeing you in the future.